I could even couldn't refresh my mind. I wrote about the Nurembergs in this copy, but I'm constantly revising it.
Of course, that's the wonderment of memoirs. You wonder how people ever get them done, you know?
I know it. I suddenly, when I can't sleep, I keep be talking about, you know, and or emphasizing or rephrasing things. And I was in a shipwreck one time, right after World War II, and they would say, "Oh, you should only write about World War II." But then it was an interesting story that I should include that in my. It was right after World War II.
So you were born in Chicago, Illinois.
Chicago in 1921.
And most important question that we'll probably ask all day: Chicago White Sox or the Chicago Cubs? What's your favorite team?
I think it was the White Sox. Yeah, yeah. I didn't follow baseball too much. It's funny. I was nearsighted when I was very, very young, you know, and I couldn't play ball sports, but I was big and strong, and I was big, but I've shrunk about 3 inches now from my back. But I was very strong. I was a weightlifter and gymnast, and I wanted contact in boxing, wrestling, fencing, of course, and contact sports was my thing. I remember when I qualified in the last year in high school. I qualified for gymnastics and fencing at the same time. I went into the Bartlett Gymnasium, which is the big gymnasium in Chicago. I had one gymnastic bag in one hand, fencing bag in the other, and I go into the place and I walk into the big gymnasium. Half of the gymnasium was gymnastics, half fencing, and I have to make a choice. Which way am I going to? Which sport am I going to pursue? And I see this big, powerful kid, you know, with shoulders this big on him, you know, and he was so powerful. And he was going up a rope like that. It was like a monkey. He would up and down, you know. I said, "Oh my God, I could never compete against this guy," you know. So I said, "I'll go be a fencer." So I chose fencing instead of gymnastics. But I always liked fencing. So. Where are we? We
were Cubs. White Sox.
Oh, yeah. I didn't go into ball sports. I couldn't see the ball. I mean, I played baseball like crazy growing up. You know, especially just street ball. You know, and little football, but baseball all the time, and track sports. You know, but I liked contact sports.
And then such a vast array of illustration subjects, but I see you've done a lot of sports.
I did a lot of sports. I worked for Sports Illustrated for about 6 years as a freelancer, and when I made the Olympics in '52, I made the '56 Olympics as well, by the way, but I didn't go because I got hurt just in my eye. I had a detached retina just about a week before the team was to leave for Melbourne. As soon as I made the '52 Olympics, I was already working for Sports Illustrated. They figured I knew everything about all sports, you know. But I knew about 3, you know, pretty well. But they would send me out with champions, and I'd photograph them doing their thing, you know, and I would try to find out how they play the game, what makes them a champion, you know, and try to dissect that into drawings and then parlay that into my drawings and my artwork. And so they sent me out with Jack Nicklaus, you know, one day, or 2 days maybe, and let's see, Arthur Ashe, I did 2 or 3 books with him, or 2 books I think with him. And a lot of golfers, which I didn't play. I did very little golfing. Tennis, I did a lot of tennis, and I worked for Tennis Magazine for about 6 years also. But anyway, it was a nice assignments, you know. Very often, if you go to a golfing match, you're sitting on waiting for them to give you some time to demonstrate their swings, you know. Yeah. So you're sitting there, but you're getting paid all the time, you know. It's by the hour. And so I didn't mind that, you know. And it opened up a lot of avenues for me, the sports background. And in Europe, I trained in Europe for fencing. I think I was the only person in World War II to be training for the Olympics. All through World War II, right from the start. I was over for about 5 years. I was there. Let's see, 1942. I just went over at the end of '42, and I didn't come back to 1947. But I trained all the time I was over in Europe with the best European coaches. And so when I came back, I cleaned up, you know. With America. I was very well grounded. See, the Americans aren't as strong generally.
Right.
So when I made the Olympics, I did very well. For an American, as an amateur, which I just brought up in my book too, because I was sitting on the Olympic bus with the guy who won the first place in the fencing in the Olympics, and he turned to me, and nobody was listening to us. You know, we were all alone on the Olympic bus, and he turned to me. He said, "Oh, you Americans, you're stupid." He said, "You're all amateurs." He said, "We Europeans were all professionals," and he said, "You, the British and the Australians, are the only true amateurs." And he said, "We Europeans, we're all professionals." He said, "Each industry in Europe is assigned a sport, and they're taken care of monetarily, job-wise. They'd be listed on their books as working for this particular company or industry, but they don't work. They just train all day long and they compete on weekends, you know." So, but that's a hard thing for an amateur to beat against that kind of training, you know. At most I could do was maybe two nights a week or 3 nights a week was the best I could train. But I ended up it was a semi-finalist, you know, which was pretty good, you know.
That's terrific.
So I ended up about 13th. But I always felt if I could have trained like they did, I would have been a finalist, you know. And so I brought this up in my book that I just wrote recently. And but the thing is, if I had opened up my mouth for what he confessed that they were all professionals, you were supposed to be an amateur in the Olympics. And he's confessing that nobody's an amateur in Europe, you know. But they would have had to return all their medals if I'd opened up my mouth, and everybody would have moved up in rank. But I didn't dare open up. No, he would have denied it that ever having said this, you know.
Sure.
But anyway.
You ended up going into the Army in 1942. You
Late 42.
You enlisted?
I enlisted, yes.
Yeah.
And I went into the Air Corps immediately. They put me in the Air Corps, I remember, and they were all sent to Atlantic City. Atlantic City had requisitioned all the hotel. I'm sorry, the Air Corps had requisitioned all the hotels in Atlantic City for the Air Corps. And we were marching up and down the boardwalk, you know, singing patriotic Air Corps songs. But prior to that, though, it was interesting. I was a professional for about a year before I went into the Army, maybe a year and a half. And this last job I had was a prestigious studio called Kling Studios, and but it took in like almost an entire block in downtown Chicago. And one of the salesmen disappeared for about a month, I guess, and he was an art salesman, and came back to us a little bullpen that we had of about 3 or 4 artists that were all in a little bullpen. He stuck his head in our little room that we had, and he had a new officer's trench coat on, 2 gold bars on his shoulder, and he said, "Anybody want to be an artist in the Army?" And I was working away, and I said, "Sure." I remember saying that, you know, and I ignored it, and I kept right on working. But he must have turned in my name to the War Department. So when I was drafted, so my name popped up as a professional artist. And what does the Army think, or the government think of an artist? They think of camouflage. So I went right into a camouflage unit attached to the Air Corps, which I knew nothing about. I knew nothing about the camouflage. But they had about 15 artists, you know, supposedly do camouflage on the side of the airplanes and the airfields. But while I was sent overseas to North Africa, in the early part of 43, in January 43, I landed in North Africa. And I had a break, was a little bit of leave, and I had a day off, you know, so I went down into the streets of Algiers and started walking around. I see an art gallery. And I was just teaching myself a little French at the time, and I was able to converse a little bit to the gallery owner. And they were talking. He said, "Oh, you're an artist?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Is there more like you?" And I said, "Yeah, there's a whole bunch of us up on the hill back of Algiers." And he said, "Oh, why don't you get them all together and we'll have a showing, an exhibition of GI art. It'll be the first GI art exhibition in the continent of Europe, you know. So he said, but you have to get a little publicity. He said, there's a Stars and Stripes office. They just opened up right down the street. Go there and tell them there's going to be a show on, you know. So I went there, and the sergeant at the desk, you know, he was all by himself. There's nobody. They had requisitioned a bank building, and in downtown Algiers. And he said, "Oh, you're an artist?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you have anything of your work?" I said, "Well, I have this little sketchbook." And he said, "Can I borrow it?" And I said, "Sure." So he all of a sudden he took the sketchbook and went back to an office back there where an officer was in the back room there. And all of a sudden, 2 minutes later, he beckons me back, you know, the room to meet the officer. And the officer said, "Do you want a job?" You know, I said, "Oh boy, do I!" And so they just opened up their office, and they needed an artist. They had no artist, so I was the very first, and I was the last, first and last staff artist on Stars and Stripes.
No kidding.
So it was fortuitous happening there, you know, and so it's changed my life entirely, because these were all the professional, what can I call them? They were all, well, to say brainy was another word I should use. Highly educated writers, and they came from all walks of life, but primarily publishing, you know, and newspapers. They came from New York Times, the World Telegram, San Francisco Chronicle. So this was a highly talented bunch of enlisted men, and so it was I was so lucky to get onto the Stars and Stripes, and but then they but I was so busy working as a staff artist for them. I had to do maps, cartoons, and then illustrations. Most of it was for dispatches coming from the front, and I would have to do feature stories of battles that they have, you know. And I was lucky enough to be able, being a good draftsman, I could draw from the top of my head and translate the stories into illustrations. Practically one a day, you know, and you had to draw very fast.
Yeah. Speaking of cartoonists, your paths did cross with Bill Malden.
Yeah, Bill Malden came in when we got into Naples, Italy. And so I was 1 year in North Africa, in Algiers, and then the invasion of Italy, Sicily, and then Italy. And then he came on board, and I mentioned in my book, it was so strange that his first drawings that he did for Stars and Stripes was very anemic, very weak. And I called him over to teach him how to do a gutsy brush line. I see this is wartime, you know, and you got to have a good, strong line trick. So I demonstrated to him, and he just watched me work for about a half an hour. And he never said a word, never said thank you. He walked away, and he changed overnight, and he started working in that technique he used all through the war. And
right.
He never changed from that technique for the rest of his life. And it kind of annoyed me a little bit that he never even said thank you, you know, because I changed his whole life but he wasn't drawing. You don't know how to delineate a man who's been at the front for a month or so, and he's so bedraggled and ragged, and no, I'll say ragged, but the clothes on his pants are all wrinkled, and you know how to get those folds into the pants. It's a way of drawing it anyway, how to delineate it. And so she copied my technique, and then, but shortly after, well, a few weeks later, somebody said, "Oh, your work looks like Malden's." I thought, "Oh my God, you know, here I had to change my technique because he was getting all the notoriety, and I was not getting the notices he was." But we were good friends, and we had a two-man studio all through the war, and we kept it up right to the end, you know.
Did he have the characters then? Was it you know,
his characters?
Yeah.
Well, he made them up, and I ended up being Willie and Joe a few times, not too often. Occasionally, Ed would hold a pose, you know, and I would pose for him, you know,
right.
for Willie and Joe, you know. And but we were good friends. We double dated, you know, and well, we were in Italy. There was two young signorinas, you know, and they were cousins. And I remember going out on the beach with them in the northern part of Italy, of Naples rather. Of course, we went with the chaperones. The chaperones stood always close by, or rather sat close by us. Make sure there's no hanky-panky. And, Bill was a good boy, though. He kept his nose pretty clean, except for the one little instance which I wrote in my book about when he got the contract for writing up front. And that's a funny story because he told me he got a advance on the royalties of $5,000, and to celebrate, he took a young lady up to his room, and his room was next to me, to my room, where I was shacked up with my girlfriend. This was in Grenoble, and he took this very cute, very pretty young girl up to his room, and he shut the door, and my room was next to him, his room rather, and he could hear the typewriter clacking and clacking. Then all of a sudden, you hear the bed springs going, squeaking. Then the clacking of the typewriter again, and then back it went on for a whole week, and they never came out. We shoved the food under his door, and he stayed there for a whole week. He wrote up front and with this young lady, and so that's a story of how up front was written.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, there's certain inspiration there again.
Yeah.
Speaking of partying, I see that you actually partied with Edith Piaf.
Yeah, that was a Christmas party at Stars and Stripes. We were in Marseille at the time, and she was very nice. She was obviously, all these French gals, they were boyfriends. Her boyfriend was Yves Montand, which was the French actor, and became very famous. He looked like he was about 18 years old at the time, and I don't know for sure, but they, it's a well-known, and he was a handsome young guy. I think he was at my age. We were maybe 19 at the time, and he looked about that age. And she came to a Christmas party, but she had a little group of actors and stage people. Not many. There was about 4 girls. They put on some kind of a skit, But one of the girls liked me, and I liked her at that night with Edith Piaf, and then they disappeared for about a week, and then I got a phone call from her, this young lady, and she said, "Oh, she'd like to stay with me if I would allow it." I said, "Of course," So she became my mistress, and so we were together for the next 4 years. Then she got a job at the Folies Bergère and worked her way up to one of the lead dancers, and that's where I learned my French, So that's the way. But you had to learn. She didn't speak a word of English, and I had to learn French, and. But she was my girlfriend. But I stayed with her for so long. Eventually I had to leave. In 1947, I decided I better. Hated to do that. I had to break away and back to the United States. I've often wondered what would have happened if I would have had to stay there and become French. And I didn't want to do that at that point.
Sure.
I had a whole career ahead of me to develop. But she was quite a looker, and she was what they call a première nue, which means first nude. She was constantly, undressed, shall we say, on the stage.
Interesting. How did you find you're working with Stars and Stripes, and then the war ends, and you get an assignment? Did somebody come up and say, "Hey, Ed, I'd like you to go to Nuremberg and do some sketching"?
Yeah, pretty much that way. So, because the Stars and Stripes would assign me different episodes to do, such as meeting General de Gaulle or any dignitaries that Josephine Baker, for instance. I met with her, and then I went with, of course, to the Monte Cassino, Battle of Monte Cassino. I went 3 times there. So I had to wait for an assignment. So one assignment would be after the other, or meet with the French army in the Alps, and I would cover that. And I was up to me to find stories. And then the Nuremberg was a culmination of all the stories I've been doing for the last 3 years, I guess, because I count the other 2 years was after the war. But they assigned me to see. Just prior to that, I had to cover the Russians at the fall of Berlin, just at the close of the war, and then the very last assignment was Nuremberg, and I only spent 3 days there at the Nurembergs. And my job, of course, was to record the proceedings. Mm-hmm. And how many I would do was up to me. And I was in the press gallery of the Nurembergs, and which was very close to where the defendants were. They were the right angles to me. And I started to sketch the defendants. Hermann Göring was the closest to me, so I concentrated on him. And then next to him was Hess, and then Keitel was next to him. But they would change their seats periodically, and sometimes they weren't always in the same order. I only did the first row of defendants, and I did the judges, you know, Speaker Alderman and the German Defense Council. And I worked with a fountain pen, which is kind of a gutsy to, you know, because you can't make a mistake when you work with a fountain pen, because whatever you draw, that's it for life, you know, for good. But Göring seemed to be in charge, you know. He had a feeling, he gave the feeling that he was still running the show, and I got the impression he had his uniform on, but he had lost a lot of weight. You know, he was pretty heavy, and I kept thinking of when a parachute lands, you know, it billows out and it gets kind of billowy, you know, and he was kind of sunken in his uniform a little bit. It kind of was loose around him, you know, remind me of a deflated parachute around him, you know. But he was pretty much in charge, and Hess next to him was. He had his head in the book. I kept reading, and so I had a hard time. I had to wait for him to get his head up to do a likeness of him, you know. And I worked through a pair of field glasses, which, because to do portraits, you have to get as close as you can, but you got to zero in on the heads, and they were actually about 25 feet from me, and that's a little too far to do a portrait. So you got to zero in on the heads. So and the thing is, nobody knows this. I'm confessing this now. Though the field glasses I borrowed from somebody, or somebody gave them to me. I don't remember what, if I borrowed them or somebody gave them to me. They were in reverse. So if you look at the Göring, he's facing the opposite way that he should be, and nobody's never noticed that he's facing. And but it came out fine, you know. I should have flipped the finished product, you know, because everybody else is facing the proper way for some reason. But with him, I used the glasses, and so I did a good job of concentrating on them.
How do you, so you're looking, do you put it
No, that's a funny thing. So I didn't know quite how to handle this. You know, I never did this before. So I found the only way you can do this using a pair of binoculars is to freeze it on your glasses. I had my glasses on, and don't move the glasses. Let your eyeballs go up and down without moving that, because you'll jar it. If you move, the head goes back and forth, and it's very disconcerting. So you can only use your eyeballs to go up and down to your sketch pad and the head of the person that you're drawing. You've got to keep it frozen in place, so only your eyeballs can go up and down. So it's very difficult to do.
Well, literally, so you're right-handed, so
I'm right-handed. I'm holding the glasses, and my eyeballs has to go up and down. I had the sketch pad on my lap, and I managed it. It worked out all right, you know. And but it was very difficult to do, and I didn't realize you would have that problem to zero in on the defendants' faces, you know. But they all came out well, and I made little notes to them whenever I could to get my impression of their demeanor, you know. And
so you did this demeanor kind of contemporaneously. I mean, as you were making the note, you did. I'm looking right now at a copy. The ones you sent are already up. They're already up at the Jackson Center. I want you to.
They're nice drawings.
They really are. So you say Hess looked very hollow-cheeked and thin.
Challenging.
That stuff you kind of did that contemporaneously. I
wrote it right next to as I was drawing it. You know, see, they were all finished on the spot. See, most people do them in pencil and they go back to their studio and draw. These are all done on the spot with no changes at all. You know. So it was, I had a lot of, I didn't realize I was being a little gutsy, shall we say, to be that sure of myself that I could pull this off, you know, and on the spot, because most artists would never attempt this. There's that famous painting of the Nuremberg War Trial by that British woman artist, Dame, what's her name, Dame? She did a huge painting of the Nurembergs, but she did that back in her studio, of course, you know. She must
yeah, we do have a copy of it, yeah.
You know, and, but I had somebody here just about 2 months ago. He's a curator of a Polish, I'm sorry, I'm Lithuanian. And they just found out, the Lithuanians just found out that I'm of Lithuanian parentage, and they wanted to meet me because they want somebody to crow about, you know.
Yeah,
so they came to record me, and like you're doing now, not quite with just the stories, but he said I think I'm the only one that covered the Nuremberg in drawings, and he said no, he think there was a Russian that came in. And I never saw his work. Were they ever published? Do you know anything about that?
I do know about that. When we were in Moscow, that artist, who was 104.
Now, is he still alive?
Just died.
He just died.
We were there in, 4 years ago.
Really?
We tried to catch up with him.
Oh, you did, really?
We did not, but we tried to. We were
Okay.
making an effort because he was not well at the time. But yeah, his stuff is out there. He did it. There's a book, a Russian book on the Nuremberg trial. And
Really?
Sketches are in there.
Oh, I'd love to have seen them.
Well, I'll find it and I'll.
Oh, I'd
send
love
you
to see a
that, yeah.
copy. I was curious to see if anybody else had done anything. So this Lithuanian person, he's got a small museum in Kaunas, I think it was, and I'm curious. And
but no, other than that, I don't know. There is and I tell you what, it's in a movie. That's why I know that. That's what triggered me to try to track him down when we were in Moscow. There was a movie that the Russians put out of the Nuremberg trial, and
Really?
they showed this sketch artist.
Really?
I'll get the clip and I'll send it to you.
Oh, I'd like to have seen that, yeah. Interesting. I always wondered if somebody else had done it.
But very few. I mean, you're rare.
Yeah.
This is rare stuff here.
Yeah.
Stars and Stripes. Did you ever meet any of the people, the reporters who were at the Nuremberg trial for Stars and Stripes?
No, they didn't send any reporters. Although I was in the press gallery, and I did a drawing of some of the press people. You know, that's what I sent you. I did about 3 of them, because I turned around, and I also did the guard. He was standing right next to me, a Scots guard, and since he was standing so quiet, you know, I said, "Oh, I'll draw him too." And then I turned around and I did some of the correspondence, and I did about 3 or 4 of them. You know, I didn't know who I didn't have any names or anything like that.
They'd sent a couple of guys toward the end of the trial, Alan Dreyfus and Norbert Ehrenfreund.
Aaron what?
Ehrenfreund.
Ehrenfreund, yeah, I don't know that name.
Ehrenfreund. And Norbert Ehrenfreund wrote a book about the Nuremberg trial.
Really?
And his time at Stars and Stripes. But you could see it was sort of come and go. The trial itself, as best we can tell, a lot of interest at the beginning. A lot of interest when Goering was cross-examined.
Yeah.
And a lot of interest at the end. In between, people got bored.
Bored with it. It was going on for quite a long time. Yeah. I remember I took a picture. I think I sent a picture of the building where all the correspondents stayed.
Right.
And I remember that was the Eberhard Faber building. I understood later on. I asked who. It was a beautiful mansion, you know, and I remember having lunch there, and they had these little. It was very high, beautiful double height dining room with little alcoves like you do have in the opera, you know, and there were musicians playing fiddle while we were having lunch. I remember that, you know, and. I went down into the streets of Nuremberg and I did one drawing. Actually, I did a drawing. I took a photograph of a bread line, and it came out nice, you know. And this is in Nuremberg itself. Oh, by the way,
impression of the city, by the way. Did you just see? Was it?
Yeah.
Bombed out? I mean, was it just?
I didn't walk around. Not too much. I don't remember. No, it wasn't terribly bombed out. but everybody looked so bedraggled, you know, and downtrodden. Everybody had their head down. It was cold, and it was November, you know, but everybody looked scurrying around the streets of Nuremberg with their heads down. It impressed me. And everything was gray, mousy gray. Of course, the time of the year, too, was gray, but the people looked, you know, a little decrepit, you know, and heads down. I remember that. And usually people walking around with their heads up. No, they were all looking very dejected to me. And I made a drawing later for an illustration. I used that photograph of the bread line. People just all lined up getting their bread, and I put two German soldiers next, overseeing the whole thing, you know, which was published in, I think, in This Week magazine. I did a lot of work for them. So I just incorporated the photograph and drawings of two Germans overseeing the bread line, you know. And
I interrupted you. You had to say, oh, by the way, there's something. Before I just interrupted you with that.
Oh, yes. I found my pass for the Nuremberg, to get into the Nuremberg. Yeah, I have it right here. Yeah.
Terrific. I'll take a picture of it.
Take a picture of it, yeah. It's I didn't know I had it. I was going through some old papers, you know, and from Europe that I saved everything. And there's my pass for the Nurembergs with my name on it. On the back, it's all printed out in 3 languages, but not in English. It was a Russian, French, and German, and with my name signed on the bottom. But I have it right. Well, okay. I don't want to disturb. Are you filming now?
Yeah, we're filming. Just curious, when you were looking through your glasses, because you were so uniquely focused on something that most people knew by name but had not seen the individuals, and you're sketching, in one sense, their personalities. And not only their looks, but their personalities. What did you think when you were focusing on the premier defendant? Was Gehring?
It's very hard to have any thoughts except delineating, capturing the likenesses. You know, I'm not listening into the proceedings. Of course, they'd be in several languages, of course. And my concentration was nailing their personalities down.
Right.
And then I made the little notations, you know, my feelings a little bit, but that was limited. And everybody was very professional as far as the judges and everybody. Well, it just stands to be that they're going to be, you know, very professional in their jobs. I keep picturing in my mind about the end of the trials when they were executing all of them, and I've seen pictures of that execution room, you know. That's always bothered me, you know.
Right.
You know, thinking of their endings, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody's ever found out exactly how Göring was it through that. He claimed he had that strychnine or whatever he had, poison in a tooth, you know, or did that officer help him out by giving him something, you know.
Still one of the mysteries. Many mysteries of Nuremberg.
Nobody knows how he managed to get this poison, you know. It's funny, I went to the Hitler's bunker at the end of the war when I was doing the job for covering the Russians at the fall of Berlin. I was there about a week, and I was roaming all over the city, and I went to the bunker, which is in the Reichstag, at the bottom of the Reichstag. It was all bombed out, and but the doorway of his bunker was filled with rubble, and it was pitch black, and it's so dark, and it was all debris going down the stairway, and I had no flashlight. I couldn't have seen anything, but I wish I could have gone down there. I could have, but I wouldn't have seen anything because I had no light, and it bothered me. And I must have taken a picture, which I cannot find. I must have taken a picture of the bunker, but he had a little bit of a garden pool right outside his bunker, a doorway, and there were 2 Russians washing their shirts in his garden pool, which I recorded, I photographed, and I made a drawing of it too, you know. But it was nobody there except that I went into the Reichstag itself, which was right next to the bunker. It was all bombed out. The wall was there was no wall next to it, and there were 2 people in there. It turned out to be I found out later that Lithuanian curator that came, saw my photograph. She said, "Oh, that's a very famous Russian correspondent," and she's interviewing somebody, and I got a picture of her in the that's open space that was bombed out of the Reichstag, and the walls and the columns holding up the building were all, you know, hit with shell fire and what have you, and holes all over the place. But the Russians had put their names all over the walls, like graffiti. And I was wondering if in my photographs, if you could see the names and trace down who was there, you know. Because we had a thing during World War II, the American soldiers always had this joke in a cartoon called Kilroy. And Kilroy was here, and the Russians were doing the same thing, that they were there. They wanted to be remembered that they were in Berlin at the fall of Berlin. And I did one painting of a Russian having his photograph taken, you know, in the streets of Berlin, which I still have over there. And they want to send pictures home to their family to say, "Hey, I was in Berlin at the fall of Berlin," you know, and they'd like to be, you know, remembered.
You had a chance to take photographs of and to meet some of the interesting World War II personalities. I'm looking at one right now of Charles de Gaulle.
Charles de Gaulle, yeah. I was that was taken in Nice, France in 1943. No, 40. No, it had to be. Well, it could have been end of. No, it had to be. No, it was in Italy by then. No, it had to be 44. Yeah, it was in Nice, France. Yeah, 44. And I was in all the. I remembered that all the officers left, and I was all alone with him on the balcony. And I remember crouching very low, you know, and getting up his big nose, you know, and I was photographing out there. And it's funny, years and years later, I was covering the air show in Orly Aerodrome outside of Paris, and he was there, and he saw me. He turned around and looked at me. And he gave me a big smile, and I think he remembered me being on the balcony with him, you know. And I did some drawings of him, you know, later for the government actually, and. But I was detached with the French army very often, and I had some interesting stories of, you know, I met with the French resistance fighters on the Atlantic coast of France, where the Germans had left, but they left. That whole quarter of France was demilitarized. There were no Americans, no Germans, no nothing, and so I was the very first American soldier that whole set. Well, I was sent there with a writer from Stars and Stripes to cover a uprising of Republicans against the Franco regime, and so the writer and I got a Jeep and a little trailer, put some provisions in it, but there was no military whatsoever from Marseille to the Atlantic Ocean, which was about a good day and a half trip.
Wow.
And the people that we met never saw a Jeep before, they never saw an American soldier before, so we were like a conquering army. And so they were fascinated with the Jeep. They were crawling all over it, you know, to look at getting under it. So anyway, we when we got to the Atlantic Ocean, it was in Anday, which is right on the Spanish border, and Biarritz is on one side, and Anday, and what's the other French town? Anday and I can't remember the name of the town. Anyway, we met with all the French officers. They're all resistance fighters, but now they're kind of a National Guard, you know.
Right.
And so it was interesting. So they didn't know who I was, and my French at that point was pretty good. So and all I had was a correspondent patch on my shoulder, but I think I was probably a sergeant, you know, or something. So they thought I was an officer. So they wanted me to review their troops. So they had all the French troops lined up in the parade ground next to the National Guard place that they had the building. So I had to pull. I saw somebody do it in a movie, so I pretended like I was officer, and so there I am solemnly walking up and down the file of French soldiers with all their receivers pulled back of their rifles, you know, and I'm checking their buttons on their, and seeing that the rifles are clean, and,
Oh my God.
and nodding my approval of everything, and all these French officers were following me in the back, looking for me to approve their equipment, and then they ushered me into the mess room and cooked me a French omelet with lots of brandy on it, you know, it was flaming with flames up 2 feet over the platter. The French chef coming out with his flaming omelet, you know, it was very good. Plus a bottle of cognac too, with the omelet, you know. And then we went up onto the meet with the Spanish troops down the border. We went up to the French-Spanish border, and the Spanish troops, when they were border guards. And of course, they had this big swath cut through between the boundary of the two countries, and it was all denuded of trees, so they could watch if anybody is crossing the border. There was no shrubbery, no nothing, but they were all dressed in German uniforms, except that the insignia was changed on their collars. They all had German helmets, you know, and. But as soon as they found out that we were Americans, they, oh, would you like a tour of Spain? You know, but you can't do that when you're, you know, it was a neutral country, and you're not supposed to do that if you're an American soldier, you know. So I had to turn it down.
You mentioned when you were back to Nuremberg there that you did your pictures and used the term fountain pen and spit.
Yeah.
What's that mean?
Well, I didn't have any water with me,
yeah.
And the drawings are in halftone,
Yeah.
and the only way you get a halftone, I was using a soluble ink, which was not permanent ink, so you could push it around. You'd wet your fingers with your tongue, and rub it on, and I did it right on the spot, you know. So I rubbed it. And when I donated the drawings were donated to the Holocaust Museum, they were all upset about that. They had to have them all, you know, they treated, you know. So they said, "Oh my God, it's going to rot," you know. The drawings are going to rot. But that's the only way I forgot to bring any water. I didn't have any, and it would have been too awkward, you know.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I had to spit on my finger and rub the halftones on the drawings, you know. So I pulled it off, you know.
Oh, absolutely. I was reading a little bit on a lot of stuff on you on Google and stuff. One of the things was when you were at Casino in 1944, you actually observed Germans radioing.
There was a lot of contact between. It happened twice at a Casino. The second time was a fascinating story because it should have changed all history. That day I was there because they had a firefight the day before I got there, and there was a lot of dead on the field. And that morning, I was in a forward command post, and American, of course, and the Germans radioed down to the Americans, said, "Could we have a truce to clear the field of the bodies?" And the Americans said, "Hey, why not?" So they got together. They got on the field together and started clearing with litters, you know, clearing the field of the Germans and the Americans. But they were so close to each other that they started talking to each other, and they started exchanging souvenirs. The Germans had that swastika flag. It was one thing which he gave to one of the soldiers, which I'd made a drawing of. That was his souvenir. And they had schnapps in their canteens, and the Americans loved that. And the Americans had American cigarettes and chocolates, and the Germans did not have any American cigarettes. They loved American cigarettes and chocolates. But chocolate was in short demand. I mean, it was very rare to get chocolates of any sort, and cigarettes. So they were exchanging. So they started talking to each other. And the Germans, what I understand, said, "You guys are friendly. What are we doing shooting at each other?"
Yeah.
And they got together and they said, you know, "We like you Americans, you know, would you want to come over for dinner tonight?" So they invited over for dinner that night. And the Americans said, "Yeah, but first of all, we have to check with our officers back at the lines." Of course, when they went back to their officers and said that we've been invited over for dinner on the German side of the lines, and of course the American officer said, "You can't do that." Said, "No way." But war could have been over that day when the fighting men got together and they said, what the hell are we doing fighting against each other? Let's all go home.
Right, right.
And that was a historical moment that nobody knows about and should have been recorded. Everybody said there was no truces in World War II, but there was. I was part of it, you know. They had a truce in World War, did I say World War I? I meant World War II.
Two, yeah.
And they had one in World War I, which is famous. They made a movie out of it, you know, which they lasted about a month or a month and a half, you know. They had a great time. But this only lasted one day, you know. But the Germans were willing to call it quits and go home, you know, according to the enlisted men. See, the enlisted men and the officers are different things, you know. But it was an interesting bit of history right then and there, and nobody knows about that story. And but the war could have been over. It was given to the, you know, turned over to the enlisted men. They would have all gone home. The other time that they radioed down was at Casino. Everybody was stalemated. Of course, the Germans were on the high ground at Monte Cassino, looking down the throats of the Americans and the British, and the Poles actually were down there too, and they couldn't move. They couldn't move, and I remember I thought it was kind of underhand what happened. Then the French brought in their desert fighter. They called Goumier, which is the desert fighters. The native colonial troops, they're all dressed in they call them jalabas, you know, with the burnouses, you know, with the hoods and the striped, and they're on horseback, and they're being brought up into the lines. Americans were dying, and I think that the British brought in their Gurkhas, French brought in their Goumiers, and I don't know, the Indian troops. But I had a feeling that why are they bringing all these colonial troops in? And I think they were figuring, if somebody has to die, let the colonials die. And they were bringing them up, you know, into the front lines. Anyway, so these French Goumier troops were used, they're famous for being night fighters and knife fighters at the same time. So their job was to crawl up the sides of Monte Cassino, and the Germans were on the high ground, Americans were on the middle ground and the low ground, but they had to go to sleep at nights with their, you know, in their foxholes, or and these African, the native troops would crawl on their hands and knees at dead of night, and when they found a sleeping soldier, they would feel the helmets, and if the helmet was rough, which meant it was an American soldier, they kept on crawling up the side of the slopes of the Monte Cassino. And if it was smooth, that meant it was a German. They would take their knives and cut the throats of the sleeping soldier, and keep on going up the side of the inclines. And the next morning, the Germans would find all their men, or so many, I don't know how many there would be, with their throats cut. And they were pissed off as hell about this, and they radioed down. I remember the comment came to the Stars and Stripes that this is no way to fight a war. That was their comment. They were annoyed about that, finding all their men with their throats cut.
Yeah.
And so then they rewarded all these desert fighters who came right off the desert in their open-toed sandals. They were given shoes because it was cold up there and it was snow on the ground, and they were rewarded by giving them shoes. That was the rewards. But there was contacts between them. Nobody knows that they would radio down to each other, you know. The Germans, there were some who spoke good English, you know. And,
Having met so many interesting personalities, are there one or two personalities that sort of jump out?
Yeah, oh God. This is a long story, though. Oh man, this is a story. I want to keep, I don't want, in a way, it's going to be made into a movie.
Okay, all right.
It's going to be made into, I'm trying to keep it kind of quiet, but I'll
give me the readers.
Give you the screen rights on this. I wrote it in my book, but it's a fascinating story. To me, it's the most fascinating story of World War II. We were in Naples. It was Bill Malden and myself in our little two-man studio, and there was a group of artists being sent over from the United States to paint the war. Because Life magazine had already sent over a bunch of artists to do their thing of painting the war. And so there's another group coming on. I don't know who sponsored this, but there were 7 of them. And so they arrived in Naples. and they wanted to meet Malden and myself. We were the staff artists, you know, just seeing our names on this, so they wanted me to say, okay, fine. They show up at the office of Stars and Stripes, and one stood out. And as I was talking to him, he was a heavy German accent. And we were talking, and I mentioned I was Lithuanian for some reason, and he said, "Oh, you're a Lithuanian." He said, I come from East Prussia, or rather, he went to school, and his family were originally from Austria, but he settled in East Prussia, which is right next to Lithuania. So he told me about all his college chums were all Lithuanian, you know, and so he warmed up to me. And he said, you know, this is my 5th war. And I said, oh, really? No, this is a very heavy German accent, too, by the way. And he said he was in the Spanish Civil War in the 30s. Hitler was sending over his best officers to get on the spot training for the coming war. And he was a general, by the way. He was a general. He still told me he was a general. His father was a general. His grandfather was a general, going back for generations. So he must have been a big mucky-muck, you know. And he said he also was Mussolini. He said it was with Mussolini chasing the Libyans, the Somalians, and he said he was in a Balkan War, which I don't know what that. But I mentioned it to somebody. He said, "Oh yeah, that was a war." I don't remember what it was. And the other two I don't remember, but I do remember him saying. I found out later that he was also in the French Foreign Legion. So this guy had training like no man had ever got training, you know. And so we decided to have a dinner that night. We were all going to meet at Bill Malden's apartment. We all get together and have some drinks and talk. And this German, but his name was Baron von Ripper, Rudolf von Ripper. Now here's a guy with that kind of a background. And so we meet at Bill Malden's apartment, and unbeknownst to us, there was a congressman back in the United States who heard about these 7 guys, and he said, "Oh, they're able-bodied men, and they're got brushes in their hands, and they're going to paint the war. They shouldn't have brushes in their hands. They should have guns in their hands." And overnight, he rescinded their status as civilian artists, painting the war, to buck privates in the American Army. And that night, we were sitting having drinks at Bill Malden's apartment. Bill had started a little fire, he had a little fireplace, and we're drinking, and he had some canapes and a lot of cheap Italian vino, you know, wine, and a knock on the door. And in fact, I answered the door, and there was an MP standing on the other side of the door, and he's got a paper in his hand. And he read from this paper, and he wanted to know if all these 7 guys were present, you know. And yes, everybody said, "Yeah, we're all here." And they said, "Well, as of now," the wording was, "as of now, you are all buck privates in the American Army, and you have to report to your closest replacement depot by 6 o'clock this morning." And boy, did those guys get drunk. They were drinking like crazy. Here they are, civilians and everything thrown in the American Army. By 6 o'clock in the morning, they were all gone. They were all gone. And but about a month, I don't know, it was a few weeks later, we're hearing strange stories coming from the front about somebody capturing German prisoners all by himself. And so, oh, this is an interesting story, so we got to send somebody down to cover this story. So Marty Harris was our staff photographer. He kept his cameras in my room because I had a lock on my door, so he kept all his cameras in my room locked up. So he disappeared. He's going to cover the story photographically. And after the 4th day, all of a sudden he comes back with his cameras up to my room. And I said, Marty, I said, "What happened?" He said, "Oh," he said, "Ed, it's our old friend Von Ripper." I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, I went with him in a foray into the German lines." And I'm dying to hear this story. And he said they crossed over a river and and the other side was the German lines. He said as soon as they crossed over, the shots were coming from the Germans are shooting at them. He said the bullets were binging all around them. He said Marty said, "I hit the ground," and he said, I'm trying to dig a quick foxhole for cover. But he said, but I turned around and looked, and he said, "That son of a bitch," he said, his words were, I'm quoting him exactly, "my son of a bitch was standing bolt upright." and he has a sketch pad in his hand, and he's sketching the Germans that are shooting at him. But he was lucky, but nothing had hit him. But he yelled out in German, and immediately the whole German line went silent, all silent. But they recognized the German general's voice. So he walked into the, now he's of course he got an American uniform on, private uniform by the way too. And he walked right into the German lines, and he was there, Marty said he was there about a half an hour. And after about a half an hour, he said, 20 Germans come with their hands up, coming back to the American lines with von Ripper, with sketch. I don't think he even had a gun. He had a sketchbook in his hand, walking behind them, guiding them back into the German lines. But they had a hard time getting into the German lines because it looked like it was here's this guy with a heavy German accent in an American uniform with all these guys with their hands up, surrendering. It's an unbelievable story, you know. And but he got away with it, and he kept on doing it for another month. I think about a month. And he became so valuable, you know, that they gave him he did this over and over and again. Sergeant York did it once. Von Ripper did it, I don't know how many times he did it, but he just single-handedly went into the German lines, and all the Germans they were happy to surrender to. It was with a German-speaking American, so-called, you know, with a heavy accent. And he was given a battlefield promotion. He went up from a buck private to an officer to a lieutenant. The next time I saw him, he was coming up to see Bill Malden, whose office was next to mine. This is, of course, in Naples, and he got a new officer's trench coat on, 2 gold bars on his shoulder, but his hand was all bandaged up, you know, and his back was turned towards me. I walked up and I said, Von, I said, what happened to your hand? He said, well, when he's holding a sketchbook, finally a bullet took off his finger, you know. It was the only casualty he had, but he was quite a character, you know. Then they gave him made him a first lieutenant too, because he was so invaluable.
Yeah.
I heard the stories that he was, you know what happened was, I don't know if it's hearsay. See, he came to the United States just before the war started. I'm trying to piece together. See, I know that one segment of him when he went into the German lines, but there's lots written on him in the internet. They know the beginning and they know the end, but they don't know this side, the portion that I know about. And I'm trying to figure out. He came to the United States, I think, just before war started, and he got into trouble with Hitler because he wanted to be an artist. He didn't want to be a German general. He told me that specifically. He wanted to be an artist, and he taught art, you know, and he went back after the war to teach at an art university in Austria. But he did a cartoon of Hitler, which was published on the front page, on the cover of Time magazine. And Hitler did not like that at all. And I don't know if that was the reason he had to flee to get out of Germany. Yeah. And I heard that Hitler killed his mother and father, but that part I don't know. Yeah. But he was already in America now, you know. And then I understood he did go into the American Army. It must have been very late, you know, like in the 1939 or something like that. But I'm not sure about that portion. And but later on, there was written that at Monte Cassino that when he walked into the German lines, if the German officers didn't obey him immediately, he shot them between the eyes right immediately. He had no, he just like, he was getting revenge, it seemed like. For that, but that maybe that story that Hitler had killed his mother and father could have been true, but he was ruthless about killing Germans. Yeah. And that's written up somewhere. I read that somewhere that he would just, you obey me or, you know, he shot. And he came here to the United States after the war, and he died. He lived in Westchester for a short while, and he went back to Europe. He was teaching art in Austria, I believe, and he died shortly after that. And I got a call from a guy who lived in Woodbridge, and somehow he heard I must have mentioned that I knew von Ripper, and he said, "Oh, you know von Ripper?" I said, "Yeah," and he said, "Oh, I know him very well," and so we were supposed to get together, and I would have loved to have gotten his story, but I kept phoning him, but he never answers his phone. Somebody says, well, he never answers his phone. You have to write him an email. It's the only way he'll answer, which I kind of completely forgot about it. And I didn't follow up on it, and I should have.
Von Ripper, R-I-P-E-R?
R-I-P-P-E-R.
Okay.
Von Ripper. He was a Baron. Baron Rudolf von Ripper. I have one photograph of him, but it's from the Stars and Stripes, and he's leaning over a dead German, and he's sketching him, you know. But it's a terrible photograph. It's the only thing I was able to salvage. I don't have the original. It's all, you know, dots in the production. But it's an interesting story, and that can you imagine a novel? You could fake this.
Absolutely.
It's an unbelievable story. This guy was Ernie Pyle wrote about him. And I have the book here somewhere. And Ernie Pyle wrote. He said he's the most interesting and fearless man he'd ever met in his life. So if Ernie Pyle thought he was such a, you know, he was full of holes, I heard, too, from getting shot. Had many wounds in his legs, like 3 of them or something like that, you know.
This is classic. The pen is mightier than the sword. I mean, it's the perfect setup. You know?
Yeah, and he's a fascinating guy. He stood very erect, you know, and homely as hell, too. You know, he was very German. I thought it was a buck, and his hair was cut just off like a Kraut haircut, we used to call a Heine haircut. Right. And he was very erect. I can't know how old he must have been, about late 30s at the time I met him, you know.
Yeah.
But he had quite a history, and it fascinates me. I wrote about it in the.
When's this manuscript going to be available?
I am trying to get it published, and I can't get it. I can't get anybody to publish it. You know. I might have to publish it myself. I have copies of it, but I keep revising it, and I keep adding to it. I have a copy. It's well, I probably could give it to you, but I'm going to throw the older copies away. But it's not. But I had it all copyrighted. You know, I'm copywriting it. But some of the stories I have are unique. You know, nobody knows about, especially the Von Ripper story. That should be made into a movie. You know, I can't imagine. It's an unbelievable man.
You're an unbelievable man. This is, Ed, I can't tell you how much fun I've had.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
This has been wonderful for me, and I know I've taken up a lot of your time here today, but this is fabulous.
Well, it's a lot of my history. If you want to look at some of the pictures, you can go through. They all have stories behind them. Well, like there's that picture of the Nuremberg. Well, I'll show you my my little. Looks like something out of a movie still, you know.